Under a sky braided with green aurora and torchlight, a single silhouette moved with mechanical silence over moss and broken banners. The figure crossed stones that had been trodden by kings and by thralls, by men who died singing and by men who died silent, and his boots bent the old grass without a sound. He was a warrior of Starforge, stepping into a world that kept its reckonings in song rather than in seconds. When John 1:17 came to the ramparts, the air itself seemed to take a breath and wait. The citadel before him rose like a sorrow, a ring of blackened towers and ribbed buttresses sewn with iron. Its walls were older than the names still spoken in its shadow. Runes of warding leaned like blind sentries beneath ivy. Torches painted the stone with living gold, and in their glow men moved as if stitched to their duty. Bowmen at crenel, grooms tending great wolves and mastiffs, smiths dousing flames and coaxing broken arms back to life. Siege engines crouched in the field, enormous and patient, their ropes knotted with hands that knew every strain and snarl. Somewhere inside the battlements a bell rang, a single slow stroke that answered the aurora. He stood at the parapet and looked, and was looked upon. On one side of him the men of the host murmured like a river over stones. They came from farms and forges, from halls where ale was measured, and from huts where a child's name was the only law. On his other side were the strange and subtle kindred, a ranger whose face was weather and leaf, an elf whose hair fell like silver rain, a captain whose armor drinks the sun. They watched his shape, the hard geometry beneath green light, and they found in it both marvel and unease. The ranger, Edric, a lean man with a hawk's nose, stepped forward. "You wear a shell of iron that does not warm," he said. His voice carried little blame. It carried only the careful astonishment of someone who had read great tales and then seen their margins move. "What name have the stars given you?" John 1:17 did not remove his helm. He replied with the economy of a man who had long made the world measure itself against his orders. "I am called the Chief," he said, and his words fell flat and certain as stones in a riverbed. There was no flourish, no claim to prophecy. The name could be taken or left. His helmet's visor caught the aurora and made it a green, mechanical ocean. Around him the captains argued in the older fashion, loud, full of pause and citation of ancestors. They spoke of rights to be kept before a wall could be assaulted. Drums, plications, a parley with trumpets and banners. They spoke of pacts that bound stone to sky, of seals and burns that took time to undo. A rune master, half-bowed and clutching a staff, warned of deeper things. He touched the air as if testing a soup for poison. "This stronghold holds more than iron," he said. "It keeps a remembrance, a grief set like a stone break its hinge, and you may loose that grief." The chief's hands were gloved metal, and they moved to a map laid on the wall. Rough paper with ink, wax seals, and pinpricks that marked towers and sallyports. Beneath his visor, a faint blue pulse, an old refuge of his kind, tracked the height of walls, the slope of approach, the weight of siege engines. He listened in the way of trained ears, hearing wind as vector and mortar as mass. He placed a finger on a seam in the rampart where the mortar had been eaten by time. "There," he said softly, "that seam leads to a chamber beneath the southern tower. It will give." A murmur rose. Hands pointed, voices rose and fell like wind in leaves. The captain, a broad-shouldered man named Halvar, protested. "You would force the old stones without counsel of our priests," he said. "You would wake the guardians tied to the earth's own breath." "I will not wake them if I can help it," John 1:17 answered. The cadence of his voice carried an authority that did not ask for faith. But if the cost of patience is the lives of the men below, patience will be spent with them. The bargaining of war is always a small, terrible arithmetic. The captain and the rune master exchanged looks like two men over a table worked with knives. The rune master, Feanor's apprentice in another life perhaps, spoke then of wards that were woven with sorrow and the blood of oaths. He said the wards might be unthreaded if the right song were sung and the right blood given. His words made the men draw back as if from a winter wind. The chief's helmet turned and caught the torchlight. For a long moment he said nothing. He walked the line with a deliberate, soldierly calm. He moved from manciple to mason, testing rope and pulley, listening to the breath of engines. He touched a trebuchet's wood and felt grain and age. He thumbed a sling and counted the phrase. The common folk watched him, and, as in all true conglomerates of the old world, their questions were made of two things: hope and the fear that hope will demand more than they can give. A small child crept close, daring the edge of an army's feet. She carried a wooden horse, its paint flaked like old snow. Her eyes were too large for her face, and she watched the chief as if he were a story yet unread. The elf, whose name was Lirael, softened in a way only her kind could, and she lifted a hand to still the child. "He carries a strange weight," she said to no one in particular, "not of flesh, but of ordered iron and long memory. Order and memory, two currencies that did not always trade evenly in Middle-earth. The chief's memory was of another sky, of other machines and other losses. It had taught him that decisions done quickly could be clean. Middle-earth taught that quickness could bruise the deep heart of things. Both traditions were necessary. Both would demand of him a reckoning. At dusk, the priestesses came with woven banners of blue and gray, and with them a voice older than the wagon roads told the tale of the keep. It had been built from a quarrel and a vow, the singer said. A lord had sworn to hold the land from shadow, and he had cast his promise into the stones. That promise had, in time, stiffened into ward and into will. The singer's voice threaded the camp like a braid. Men listened and some wept, thinking of their own oaths. The chief listened too, his head inclined as a man might do in deference to a new language. He did not weep. Night fell, and with it came signs that the world was not entirely pleased with the arrival of foreign iron. The aurora flared with a new intensity, slashes of green like knives under cloud, and the wind brought with it a sound not made by men, a low keening from the valley, as if the earth itself had been struck. Dogs grew restless. Sentries found their dreams broken by images of stone doors opening into wells of cold. The rune master took a torch and walked the inner terrace, tracing wards with ash and salt. He returned, face dark, and said, "The stones have heard you? They are waiting." There was an argument about the morning's plan, as there must be when men and elves and strangers make joint cause. The elf Lirael wanted a night of rites, of singing to the stones and to the lost lord's memory, to unmake the anger with music. Halvar wanted battering and blood until the gate surrendered. The rune master wanted secrecy and slow unthreading. The chief looked at them all, and then at the men who would feed the engines and carry the sick back across the field. His decision was a thing of calm rationale, rather than of sentiment. He would split the force, a contingent to hold the watchers and another to test the seam beneath the southern tower. He would use what the land could bear and no more. A man named Tolan, a sapper with a face like a plowed field, scuffed his boots in the mud. "Weave ladders and rope," he said. "We can climb and pull and set fire to the horde within." We can take the men and not wake what's under the stones. That wakes what is under the stones, the rune master replied. And if what is under is a binding of grief and oath, then the wake will be its breakfast. The chief stared at the seam again. He imagined the sudden, clean rupture of metal and stone, an engine's breath, a wall falling like a ledge of ice. He imagined, too, the echoing unthreading of a ward, the silent, freed thing that might be glad or might be wild. He had in him a catalogue of wars that left lands as flat metal and men as mere numbers. Here the ledger was different. The cost might be victory and a moral price to pay. It might, worse, be victory that unmade the very ground beneath the living. He raised his gloved hand and pointed. Soldiers readied, ropes coiled, men knelt to steady the engines. He spoke once, a short, hard command. Prepare the seam, hold the watch on the eastern bank. No signal until dusk. His words were exact and brief. They fell into the circle of ears around him and were passed like a flame along a line of men who knew how to listen to something that did not trust to heat or mercy alone. There was a pause, the kind that hangs, when a spear is drawn and men sense the throw. The rune master closed his eyes. Lirael touched the chief's arm with a fingertip as if to judge his pulse through the mail. Halvar's jaw clenched. He made no sound. The camp moved with the slow, sure movement of things that prepare not for ceremony but for consequence. Beneath the ramparts, the seam waited like a tooth in a jaw. Above them, the aurora, braided and unbraided, herald and omen. In the morning there would be smoke and the groan of wood and the shout of men. The chief, stranger among bards and kings, stood with orders in his mouth, and a map burned into his memory, and he felt, in the hollow where one keeps the quieter, remoter judgments, the thin tremor of indecision. It was not fear, it was something older, the knowledge that a hand that acts on stone may also stroke or sunder a soul. He turned then, as a captain must, and walked to the place where the men would go forward. He tightened a strap at his wrist, a soldier's small ritual. He did not speak of destiny or of song. He spoke of timing and of care. We move at daylight, he said. We move together. We leave no one behind. That was the promise they could all measure. The child with the wooden horse watched him as if the chief had just given the first line of a new tale. The singer in the fold of the tents began a low chord, not yet a song, merely a note that would hold if needed. Above them the aurora burned a long, cold green. The seam in the southern tower had been marked, the engines were yoked, and men who had mapped their lives by plow or loom steeled themselves for a morning like no other. The chief looked across the field to the sleeping towers, and his visor caught a hint of the old bell's shadow. He raised his chin, and, for a moment, the green light made him look like an omen. They would test the seam at dawn. They would try to pry open what had been sealed by grief and oath. They would learn whether iron and old magic could be set side by side, whether the songs of one world might be sung with the orders of another. The decision had been taken, and with it the turning of a key none could yet see. The wind that night smelled of iron and cold ash. It rode over the plain like a living thing, sweeping flakes of soot and the faint bitter scent of human sweat across the battlements. Men and women huddled behind the low crenels, their breaths fogging in the dark, eyes fixed on the black line of the besiegers beyond the moat. Torches burned in sockets, their light shuddering against the stranger's helm and the small alien gleam of his visor. He stood apart, hands resting upon the cold metal of the parapet, as if weighing the world beyond it. A drum murmured from the enemy camp, steady and deep, as a heart in some monstrous beast. It set the rhythm of their work. Ladders rose and fell like the tides as sappers hurled themselves at the ditch, and the clatter of iron and the dull thud of earth being undermined came to the ears of all upon the wall. A boy with a messenger's cloak leaned closer to the stranger, whispering hurried words. The stranger's visor turned, but made no sound. He spoke at last, his voice low, edged with a cadence not of those hills. It carried none the less, clear as a bell struck in a chapel. "Where will you place the men?" said a captain, a gaunt face lit by torchlight. His mail had been mended too many times. His voice betrayed a weariness that had little to do with the hour. He had given commands for a dozen sieges, and his tone was one of brittle familiarity. The stranger pointed beyond the valley, not at the enemy lines, but at a narrow stretch of the wall rent by a catapult 2 nights past. "There," he said. His words were spare. "The breach will be favored. Reinforce the north tower and gather those ready to sally." Murmurs rose. Some spoke of superstition. The stranger's armor was like night-struck, and hammered, the light from within. His helm was a pale, unblinking star. Others whispered of sorcery. The captain listened, then nodded, because a leader will take counsel where counsel is offered, and because he saw in the stranger's hands a steadiness that steadied others. Night deepened. From the enemy lines came a new sound now, the creak and groan of engines, the scrape of wood upon wood, as a great siege tower waded forward, wheeled on log and rope. Men with torches rushed to its flank, sheathing it with hides and oil. The air grew hot with the smell of smoke and the metallic tang of wedge and nail. In that light, the stranger raised a gauntleted hand and beckoned the captain near. He produced a small object then, no larger than a man's fist, and set it upon the stone. It was not the work of the smiths here. It held contours too neat, an inner hum like far-off wings. The captain bent, eyes wide, but did not touch. The stranger's gloves hovered above the thing. He spoke words no one could name and flicked a slender switch. A faint hum answered, and the hiss of something like a bellows went through the object. A thread of pale energy licked the air above it, washing the stone with a light that did not burn, yet warmed like a hearth. "Shield," the stranger said simply. It was not shield in the old way of iron and oaken doors. The light made a film, thin and clear as the skin of water, that shimmered above the parapet. Arrows struck it, they slid and popped like rain from a roof. Stones from the sappers shaved the air and fell harmlessly away. The men who had been poised at the parapet let out a sound that might have been a laugh, might have been a prayer. For a moment, the siege seemed to balk, as if some new law had been spoken that the old engines did not obey. Yet, magic or no, the enemy adapted. Arrows blackened and flamed bright against the shield, then were shot in volleys so dense that the light trembled under the weight. A catapult's great stone found its mark upon the eastern buttress, and with a sound like a hill collapsing a spray of shale, flew into the night. Men were thrown too. Their knees, one banner, drooped. The stranger's shield flickered as a minute tide might wash upon a cliff's lip, but it held. From the tower, the archers answered with a volley, their shafts singing like black birds. One by one, the besiegers' ladders fell back, scorched or shattered, to be set anew with grim persistence. Beneath the thunder of battle, the captain realized the cloth on his arm had once been white. Now it was smudged and soiled dark, and streaked with a red not named. He swallowed and did the thing that a soldier must. He turned his face to the others and spoke a plan. 3 men with rope, he said, with brittle calm. 2 at remains of the postern. If we cut the tower's ropes, it may founder. If not, we hold and wait. The stranger's visor tilted. He moved with the slow deliberation of one who has seen many fields and yet keeps the courtesy of silence. "There is another way," he said, "a thing that will strike where their machines are weakest. Give me those who will follow without question." Eyes locked on him. Some had children in the hold, some were fathers and had buried brothers in other lines. Yet courage here is not the bravado of youth. It is a tired, steady thing wrought by loss. 5 hands were raised. One was calloused and tattooed, another small and sure. No songs were sung. They clasped hands and waited. They moved beneath the shadow of the tower, strangers to one another but bound by a single necessity. The stranger's steps were quiet. His feet found purchase where loose stone would send others stumbling. He led them to the sally gate, narrow and often forgotten, a gate meant for sorties in times when speed mattered more than grand designs. It had been bricked on the outside. Old men could not let it stand open in peace, but they pried it with iron and sweat and the sharp teeth of a set of levers until the night smelled of dust and the faint salt of the river beyond. When the gate slammed open, their breath hitched. Outside the moat, the enemy's camp was a forest of flame and shadow. Soldiers worked like beetles around the great tower, steadying it with ropes, feeding embers beneath shielding hides. The stranger studied that field as a captain studies a map. His gestures were few, his commands fewer. "Set small fires to the left," he whispered to a lad with a match and the courage to use it. "Have the arbalesters cover the sappers. When the tower's ropes are spared, they will need to pull hard. They will look to the west. We strike at the angle where the lever sits." The lad did as told. A small conflagration bloomed, a line of golden teeth against the black. Men turned. A shout rolled like a wave. Across the moat, the siege tower's crew scrabbled at its flank, distracted and cursing. The stranger crouched, palms upon the stone, and set a line of those fist-sized devices along the base where the tower met its wheels. They hummed faintly, a chorus like bees. They had no thought then of sorcery or miracle, only of cunning, how to make beast and machine betray their maker. A rope gave with a snap. A pulley, overloaded with sudden strain, burst. The siege tower lurched, and in that moment men flung themselves to right it. The stranger and his 5 moved like shadows between them, each action swift and precise. And when the explosion came, it was not of fire, but of a small, bright pressure that bent wood as if it were reed. Wheels splintered. The tower dragged upon the mud and faltered, then ran, like a wounded thing, away from the wall. A howl rose from the enemy camp, the sound of men who had thought themselves sure. Torches were thrown, arrows loosed with the fury of those denied triumph. The stranger's device had not made them invisible, it had made them dangerous. The captain's men spilled from the sally gate and pummeled the surprised crew. Steel rang against steel. The smell of singed rope filled the night. Within the scraps of battle, the stranger moved differently than any man they had known. He did not stride to the rhythm of rage. He was patient as a river cutting stone. Where a man would have swung with despairing force, he stepped aside, letting momentum unbalance the foe. He used the enemy's weight as if it were a lever. When he struck, it was brief and precise, and the blows knocked a man down rather than tore him open. No one bled where the stranger had been. Wounds were taken, but not cruelly laid. A tower archer, a woman with hair like wintered wheat, found her arrow shattered against the stranger's shield. His hand moved and took a short, strange instrument from his hip. He did not shoot it like a bow, but placed it close and breathed through the helm as if measuring the wind. A single compressed shot of light sprang forth and struck the tower's wheel. The wood burned not with flame, but with a hot white corrosion, as if time itself bit away at the grain. The wheel gave, Men tumbled. The host's captain bellowed, a voice that crossed the moat and brought with it a promise of more and worse to come. He was a man huge of shoulder, his banner crowned with a wolf's head. His anger was a force that could, in some hours, gather the strength to take a city. Men answered his shout and rushed to form a new line, their faces set and terrible. They came with ladders again. They wound ropes like serpents toward the breach. Back upon the wall, the defenders cheered the success of the sortie, but did not exult. For in war, a loss merely bids the other to harden their mind. The stranger looked upon what he had wrought, and then, as if reading from some ledger of consequences, turned his head toward the north tower that still smoked where stones had fallen. He saw the men who bent to mend it. He saw the boy who had been given a torch and now shook with exhaustion. He saw, too, the new array forming beyond the moat. "Hold fast," he said to the captain and to the troops, though he had not earned a right to order them. "At dawn I will lead a strike, not for all our meat and all our treasure, but for one point, where the engines are anchored. We will not wait for them. We will go to them." The captain's jaw worked. In the flicker of torchlight, his face looked like a map of places through which sorrow had passed. He nodded slowly. At dawn, he echoed, and the words took anchor in the air. Around them, men soothed torn mail, fed lances back into their sockets, and wrapped torn hands. Little things of necessity were done. A cup passed, a strip of leather clenched on a wound. The stranger walked the parapet with long, slow strides, his footsteps a metronome to the rebuilding of courage. He paused at the boy's shoulder and did a small thing. He pressed the boy's hand, hard and sure. The boy looked up, eyes enormous. And in that look, the stranger's visor reflected a pale, simple light. He did not speak of where he had come from, nor of the wars he had fought before midnight had fallen upon this place. He did not boast of weapons that bent steel, or of hands that had pressed down entire cities. Those questions lay like drifted snow. They would be dug from later, if ever. For now there was only the wall, the smoke, the quick pulse of a drum, and the promise of dawn. A watchman called the hour. It seemed to hang then, between two breaths. The camp below muttered and reformed, and brought forward a great beast of iron, something the captains called a new engine, wheeled, with iron flanges for teeth. The stranger's head tilted as though to listen to a distant clock, and the faint humming devices at his belt shivered like a living thing. He turned to the captain and fixed him with an even bright stare. "At first light," he said, and within that short phrase lay an entire strategy that would unspool with the rising sun. "Gather the men you trust. Give no word to the messenger who cannot read his rod. We move at dawn, and we strike at the anchorage while they sleep on their laurels." A small cheer rose, stamped down quickly by the captain's hand. Men readied their arms. Women bolstered the stores. The city exhaled and drew itself up straight against a sleep it could not afford. In the dimness, the stranger stepped back from the parapet, and men watched him move down the steps toward the gatehouse, his frame lit by torchlight like a statue walking. Outside, the besiegers' drummer repeated his tireless pace. The great engine's wheels ground upon the road. Sparks fell from metal into the river-moist mud. The night kept its long gaze. The stranger's shadow stretched upon the stones and merged with other shadows until it was difficult to say where one ended and another began. Dawn would be less than an hour away. Plans were made, or rather, made sharper. Men who had war news in their hearts sharpened blades. Men who had doubts clustered and whispered like late birds. The stranger paused on the final step and turned his helm upward toward the pale stitch of sky where gray light bled through. His breath fogged the air as if the night itself were alive. Then he descended into the city, and where his boots fell, sleep became a short, brittle thing. The ramparts would keep their watch until morning, but the restless thought that now moved through every planning mind was not of defense alone. It was of a strike, of moving out into the enemy's midst before they had learned the face of those who sheltered under the visor. It was a promise, and in promises lay the edge of the blade. The last torch guttered at the gate. Men settled into the hush that precedes action. The stranger's silhouette melted into the narrow ways below, leaving behind only the faint echo of metal. Above, the sky paled, not yet bright, as if holding its breath for what would come. A wind came down from the northern hills that carried with it the cold bite of coming winter, and with the wind came the sound of a host. It was not the measured tramp of disciplined legions, nor the lurching, bellowing surge of mere brigands. It was a tide, multitudinous and harsh, filled with the wet rasp of many throats, singing a single savage note. On the outer face of the wall the defenders braced, and upon the parapet he stood like a thing from another telling, a stranger in green steel whose silhouette broke the ancient skyline. He did not speak the tongue of this land, nor did his manner show the comforts of kin or court, yet his presence was command enough. Men who had weathered sieges since boyhood turned to him as to a fulcrum. Elenial, who had kept the southern watch these many years, leaned close beneath the battlement and watched the glint of his helm where moonlight met alloy. She had never seen such glassy, unyielding eyelets. Thorin, captain of the gate, felt a strange steadiness in his bones as the stranger checked the instrument slung at his chest and set a hand upon the pommel of a war-axe that gleamed like new steel. From the plain, the enemy raised their engines, grim contraptions of wood and iron, creaking like dying trees. They flung not only stone, but foul bladders, judged to burst in a gout of choking smoke, and sometimes clusters of pale, writhing things that crashed like rain and shattered on wood and flesh. Yet the greatest terror was their new thing, a soaring tower on wheels, its face robed in hides and iron, within which a monstrous funnel of black metal loomed and sighed. Men who had studied the arts of siege said the tower was fashioned after no design known in Middle-earth. Others said it wore runes that were not runes at all, circuits that sucked the very heat from the air. At the first note of its approach, the stranger moved. He did not cry instruction, but acted with a swiftness that threaded itself into the rhythm of the defender's labor. He planted a device at the wall's base, a small dark sphere that hummed and exhaled a fine, cooling mist. The mist ran along the stone like a living thing, seeping into mortar joints and across iron bands. When the first blistering missile struck that wall, it met not flame, but a thin veil of invisible resistance, and the missile shattered, raining harmless fragments downward. One of the besiegers swore aloud. At its failure, others fell to altered plans. The archers of the wall took him in measure now. Bowstrings sung under fingers armored in leather and cloth, arrows streaming in two tight ranks. He raised one gauntleted hand, and the volley changed course as if touched by a phantom wind, finding instead the open joints of the rolling tower where black plates overlapped like the scales of some dread fish. From within that tower a voice, hoarse and like iron scraping stone, sang a challenge, and its note became a signal. The wheels within the hosted engine turned faster. Fire and metal collided. A trebuchet shot a monstrous stone, the earth shuddered. The stranger did not flinch, but vaulted in a single long arc from parapet to battering platform, his feet thudding on greased wood as men parted to give him breadth. The cloth that covered his back fell away, revealing rigid panels and coils that breathed steam. He thrust his hand toward the tower's flank, and a sound like a contained thunderclap answered. Where his palm touched the iron, an orange seam opened, and light like a captured dawn bled out and slit the tower's belly open. Sparks flew, and for a moment the air above the plain was lit like a smithy at noon. Not all was steel and light. Among the besiegers were those who walked with a darker majesty. A man in a robe the color of ash ascended a low hill and lifted a staff that looked as if it had grown from the bone of some ancient tree. His name, if it was a name given by the tongue of men, was breathed as Nazur by some watchers in the shadows. He circled a small stone and whisper-wove an ill wind. The air near him dimmed, not from smoke, but from a thin, deepening hush that silenced birds and made even the banners hang without their usual ripple. The soldiers who watched him felt the ground grow older beneath their feet. Elenial saw that hush and cursed softly. Her hand went to an arrowhead notched in a different weave, one tipped with salts and born of old lore. She read the bending of the world the way a seafarer reads tide, and in a low tone she told the stranger what she saw. He turned a head like a raven's, and in that motion there was the cold assessment of a machine shaped for war, and a man who knew the cost of a misstep. He did not speak the name of the staff-bearer. He simply planted his 2 feet and found the balance of the wall itself. Thorin raised his voice then, and it was the voice of a man who had commanded men into mud and smoke. He ordered his ladders set and his men to boil their tar. He called for the catapults to aim not at walls, but at the flanks of the enemy's engines. The stranger stood at the edge and watched the actors of that time obey. Bows, ropes, and the slow, raw artistry of siegecraft. He fitted a narrow device to a cross-beam and wound it tight. The device sang, a keen, humming thing, and when it uncoiled, it released a flash that sheared a rope and brought an engine to a halt. Men cheered. Yet the cheer did not reach those places where Nazur whispered, for the sorcerer's gift was not of loud thunder, but of patient undoing. Where his voice flowed, the air tasted of copper armor, plates held a faint, unfamiliar frost. A banner unfurled and sizzled as black veins crawled across its surface. Many a heart condemned this new magic and compared it in fear to the ancient arts the world had locked away, but it was shrewd and sly as well as terrible. Nazur raised his staff and with a twist slowed the very turning of a wheel. The rolling tower halted as if pulled by a hand from beneath the earth. The stranger, seeing this, altered his tactic. He had not come to Middle-earth to play sentinel atop other men's walls. From the lashing wind he produced, with a motion utterly plain and quick, a rope of many ropes, thin metallic strands braided into a single thick cord that hummed faintly with a blue sheen. He slung it over the parapet and hooked it to the nearest broken rim of the engine. Men below cried warnings, but he was already rocking the cord with his weight, letting the coils sing and take. The tower shuddered and tilted as if a giant unseen had given it a backhand. A cry went up from within the rolling tower, and through its slit an arm raised a blade that blazed with a sickly greenish light. It struck the cord where it came over the rim. Sparks flew, and the cord seethed where the blade bit. For an instant the cord began to smoke. The stranger's hands tightened. Then a low, bright note like the release of a bell sounded, and the strands reformed as if healed by the very air. The blade struck again and splintered into harmless flakes. Those who watched could only stare, for the cord behaved as if it were more than rope, a living wire that did not yield to mere iron. He moved like a man trained to silence and precision, yet his gestures were also those of one who saw more than men of this age. When the defenders could no longer stand beneath the battering of certain engines, he called a small host of them down from the wall. They leapt upon the sloping face of the ruined machine, and with a mixture of axe and cunning ropes, they tore away the skin that hid the tower's workings. Through a gap they peered and saw cogs, not cut by hand, but twisted and lashed with the kind of small, precise metallurgy no smith in these lands had learned. Threads of faint light ran like veins. The men recoiled, and one of them spat out a prayer. The stranger did not answer. He reached in and plucked at a knot of glowing wires as a child might untangle a kite string, and when he withdrew his hand, it carried a small spark that was like a captured will. Nazur felt that change. His lips ceased their whispering and narrowed. He lifted his staff higher, and the hush swelled into a compression that made breath heavier. Bones creaked in the defenders' chests. The very stones of the rampart hummed with the weight of it. Elenial steadied herself against a merlin and saw men roll back in panting confusion. Thorin bellowed an order to hold, but even his voice began to thin beneath that pressing silence. The stranger, however, set his palm against his chest plate and exhaled, as though drawing warmth inward from some inner furnace. A thin blue veil appeared around him, and the hush curled against it in waves, unable to pierce the thing. Then a new sound rose, a sound that belonged neither wholly to this world nor entirely to the stranger's making. From deep within the machine-scarred earth, a drum began to beat, first slow and then like a maddened animal. The besiegers answered with a clamor of horns and guttural cries, and men fell into formation to take the field anew. Yet the drum bore a different tone as it quickened, not only war beats, but the echo of machines, the chitter of small gears, and the distant sound of something like metal on bone. The stranger looked down at the plain and measured what he saw. He turned his head toward the distant eastern river, where a low ridge threw shadows into the gathering light, and briefly, as if thinking, traced a line in the air with a gauntleted finger. At his command, the rope he had cast tightened. Men below felt their burdens lighten. Rocks that had been loosened from the wall's lip slid to controlled impact, smashing the smaller siege engines into flinders. The rolling tower, now half-tilted and burning, began to slide away like a dying beast, and with it unrolled the enemy's hope of making a breach. Nazur's staff flared then in a sudden bright pulse, and the hush snapped like a cord. A shaft of blackness shot toward the parapet, but it met an answered light. The stranger did not fling back with words. He met that blackness with an iron thing raised over his helmet. No banner, no prayer, no song, merely a thing that threw forth a blade of white noise that cut the shadow into dust. Those who were near felt the pressure of that sound in their chests and coughed. A dog somewhere whined. Even as the black flare died, the plain did not still. The enemy swarmed like spilled grain, and from within their mass a new figure swung up upon a black horse. He wore a helm with horns, not of bone, but bent metal, and he carried a spear that shivered with a pale light. He was neither Nazur nor mere captain. He was an answer to the stranger, a living challenge. Riders rallied to him and broke like a dark wave. At the sight, the stranger pulled up the hood of his cloak, and in that movement men recognized the slant of his stance, as if a signal had been passed. "If they will drive with horse," Elenial said beneath her breath, "we will meet them with steel." The stranger's voice, when it came, was like the scent of rain on pavement, small, brief, and full of promise. He looked at Thorin and at Elenial, and the three shared a look that needed no translation. Then he moved down from the parapet, not running, but stepping with the quiet violence of something certain. He fitted the spark, He had taken into the gap of a battered bolt-thrower and turned its face toward the plain. Men scrambled to his side, and a coin's worth of silence fell as they prepared to fire. Nazur raised his staff, and the earth answered again with that slow oath of drum. The horned rider drew near with his band, their shadows lengthened like black ink. The stranger placed his hand upon the bolt-thrower's crank, and, with a motion calm as a delivered verdict, began to wind. The crossbeam creaked and groaned, and the device took up a groan of its own, a deep mechanical note that rode the wind and set the hair on men's arms upright. They stood then, the two hosts, like two tides that had been called to the same shore, and the bolt-thrower, the stranger's unknown engine, and the staff of Nazur kept their breath. The stone of the rampart thrummed underfoot. Men, whose hands were rough and whose faces were streaked with soot, gripped their arms and prepared for a thing they had never known. The stranger's eyes, as far as one could see through his visor, fixed on the horseman. He wound once more. Something moved in the east, a line on the horizon, a dark fluttering that signaled not retreat, but reinforcement. The stranger felt it with the long patience of one who knows the calculus of battle. He set his shoulders and let go of the crank. The bolt flew, and all sound flung itself forward like a spear. The outer wall shuddered as if some vast hand had struck it, a tremor that ran through shield and spear like a chill. Stones that had stood for centuries gave up dust in thin, sickly plumes, and the air filled with the bitter tang of warmed rock. From the plain below came the sound of machines, not the slow, creaking engines of war that men and dwarves had known for ages, but a hard, bright clatter and the hiss of compressed breath. Lantern light glinted from incurious metal shapes that rolled and unfolded like sleeping beasts, and atop one of them a single figure moved with the economy of a hawk, the stranger in a suit of black that drank the torchlight and threw back no reflection. On the parapet, the captain who had held that section for a decade pressed his gauntleted palm to the cold stone, and could not at first find the words for what he saw. His voice, when it came, was the voice of a man who has learned to make commands into armor. To bows, to the trebuchet, do not let them find a seam. Behind him the young archers loaded arrows, and the smiths pinned down the creak of winches with their bellies. They obeyed, for they had seen ports opened wide by lesser inventions. They had not seen a thing that cast a white seam of light across mortar and mortar, a blade without an edge. The stranger spoke then, not in many words, but in a single clear phrase that carried to the ears of both friend and foe. It was a low sound, like the draw of a great bowstring. Where his hand fell upon the side of his machine, a latticework of faint blue light spread like frost over the stone, and, to the horror of those who watched, began to unmake it. Mortar melted and drained away as though poured by a slow and meticulous hand. Where battering rams would have battered and sparks would have flown, this thing sipped the stone into itself and left behind a clean, dumb hole. A cry rose from the gate, half wonder and half curse. Old men who had once faced orcaxes closed their mouths and saw in the stranger a new danger, an uncanny arithmetic of war for which no spear could be the answer. In the tower above the gate, a man in a cloak that had known better winters leaned on the parapet and tested the air with his nostrils, as a huntsman tests the wind. He smelled not only the smoke of burning pitch, but a faint metallic tang, like the smell of a forge when thunder passes near. He called down a name that fell away with the smoke. It meant little now, against a weapon that made no sound beyond its own small and terrible music. Below, the field had turned into a geometry of light. Siege lines fanned out like the ribs of some great shell. each point aligned to instruments no hand had made in these lands. Where the stranger directed, engineers, men and a few who looked other than men, fastened to their devices coils of braided wire and panes of folded glass that shimmered with inner fire. When the stranger turned a small angular spear to the east and aimed a glinting thing that hummed at his shoulder, the eastern wall answered by shedding whole slabs of mortar as if they were leaves. The defenders dashed forward to plug the breach with rope, and bodies, the rope blackened and fell away like kelp in a too-hot tide. Legends can teach a people how to stand. They do not always teach them how to move when the rules change. On the rampart, a bowman whose forefathers had bled at Helm's Deep found his arm made heavy with the impulse to throw his string aside and strike at the thing that cleaved his wall. He swung his bow as if it were a club. The stranger's helmet lifted, and the visor blinked once, a single red star, and in that flash the bowman's eyes met a darkness that was not empty, but whole. He lowered his weapon instead, for there is about the stranger a stubborn gravity that commands the faintest of obediences. From the other side of the plain came the thieves of the night, wolves and men and sorts less named, drawn by the promise of loose walls and spoils. They surged forward in ragged ranks and were met by the stranger's own legion, not wholly human, not wholly anything the folk of Gondor had seen. They moved with a precision born of iron law shields linked and boots struck as one, and the sound of that cohesion fell upon the ears like a metalled rain. When these soldiers struck, they did not battle, but punctured, removing whole arcs of door and gate by devices that hummed and hummed until the air seemed to distend. High above, where banners snapped and the moon leaned to watch, a horn was blown so long and true that even the stones might have wept to hear it. Riders surged along the stairways, their cloaks like dark water, and the captain barked for pikes. A man with silver at his temple moved with the careful speed of those who have sacrificed sleep for counsel. He sent runners to the city watch, and then to a place of old magics, calling upon favors that had been hoarded like coin. The watchmen who bore the messages found the strange machines more troubling than any orc they carried, not the smell of the battlefield, but of distant suns and the sea of stars themselves. Upon the slope, the stranger raised a device that sang like a bell in a cave. It cut the air with a thinness that made the air itself seem insufficient. Stones trembled as if they had been struck by a giant hand. A tower shutter was hoisted part way and then fell in on itself as if shame had shaken it down. Men fell back, and the lines of the besiegers poured through the new breaches as through the mouth of some hungry thing. Yet the defenders were not without craft. They had old magics, they had the slow-working cunning of men who had lived with dragons in their stories. A white light answered the stranger's bell, curling upon the edge of the wound like a hand to staunch blood. The old scholar on the northern parapet laid palms to a rune and shouted, and with his shouting came the scent of the sea and of myrrh. The stranger's blue lattice pulsed as though insulted, and then the lattice flared and retreated, not broken, but obliged to sidestep an unfamiliar force. In that pause, a line of men with ropes and iron was run up. They lashed themselves to the inner battlements and braced like trees, hold their crowns against storm. The stranger laughed, but it was not a laugh like any bark or shout known in Gondor. It was a dry, mechanical thing, a small modulation that slipped from his throat like steam. He gestured, and a column of his soldiers peeled off and began a slow, relentless climb upon devices that fixed to stone like the mouths of barnacles. These creatures of metal bit and drew, and the climbers crawled upward with unerring feet. One by one they reached the top, where cold steel met cold steel. The first hand that met a defender's wrist did not clasp it, but seized and locked. The defender felt not the heat of iron, but a small, sterile cool, and in that cool he felt an end to his balance and a tilt toward the void. On the rampart, a child of the city, small, fierce, a mariner's son, turned soldier by a hurried fate, vaulted forward with a dagger and struck the thing that clung to his comrade's arm. The blade found seam where seam should not be, and for a moment earned that small, shouted victory all heroes cherish. The stranger's hand moved. His fingers were long and sure, and he reached not for blood, but for restraint. He whispered a syllable none there understood, and the captors released their grip. The captive staggered free and tasted fear that had not yet become grief. Between the two forces, something older than war itself drifted, a query of sovereignty. The city had long been a bastion of men and kings. It accepted siege as a test tempered by honor. The stranger offered instead a calculus and a verdict, with neither bell nor counsel. He measured the stone by a standard carved not in the tongues of men, but in cold numerals, and made his judgments without the sway of pity. Those who had sworn to hold the walls felt their oaths bending under an influence they could not name. So he would take it, the captain said to the man with silver at his temple, and his voice was small. He would take the city as a smith takes a bowl, and leave us nothing to worship but the machine. The silvered man considered the rampart and the strangers below with a patience older than despair. He saluted and said, "We will not yield the crownstone. Call the beacons, let the old pacts be remembered." His words were a kindling to which the young men around him clung like damp wood. They sent the call like flares across the dark, for in war there is always a hope that kin will turn a shadow into aid. Below, the stranger put aside his devices and for the first time moved visibly as a commander. He unlatched something at his hip, and a disk fell into his hand, small, heavy, and humming with contained weather. He set it on the scarred earth, and it looked like a stone that had been taught to breathe. A hush, thin and immediate, ran through both lines. Men held their volleys in their hands, arrows and spears like frozen rain. The stranger planted his foot on the disk, and the disk drew a line of cold fire across the night, the sort of flame that does not devour, but clarifies. The captains of the keep glanced at one another, backward, then forward, counting losses and stores and mothers' names. The night had become an arithmetic in which every move could be a last. Yet even as the stranger's device drew its line and purred like a beast of impossible design, a red wick of light appeared on the far horizon. Not a star, but a signal, living and deliberate. It burned like a promise and like a warning. The stranger straightened beneath the moon, and his visor caught the beacon and reflected it like a second, smaller dawn. He did not lower his hand from the disk. The soldiers at his heel formed ranks, reformed them as though the shapes in their blood were made of angles and not song. The defenders tightened their grips on spear and crossbow. Between them the breach yawned, a wound that wanted to be either closed or widened. The man with silver at his temple turned his head toward the sound that came from the city, a sound that might have been the creak of an ancient gate or the clearing of a throat before a final prayer. "Ready," the stranger said once, with the spare clarity of a man who names only what must be named. It was the last clear word before engines hummed louder, and the hush on the plain deepened into a pressure that promised motion. The young archers on the wall bunched their shoulders and drew tight their strings, every breath held like a coin. Men wrenched ropes, taught, and prayed not for victory, but for endurance. The disk under the stranger's foot glowed, and a soft wind rose that smelled of iron and rain, yet had neither cloud nor thunder to justify it. It pushed at robes and banners, and mustered the hairs on the nape of those who watched. It promised a change either sudden or slow, and every face turned, not yet to see what would happen, but to decide what they would do when it did. They had thought the breach would be a thunderclap. It was instead a grinding, hungry thing, slow as winter and sharp as iron. Stone that had stood for 100 winters shuddered, then gave in a cascade of dust and screamed arches. Master Chief moved through that roar like a shadow made of quiet intent. His visor flashed with the pale light of the fires below. He planted his feet where men could not, and the rhythm of his stride set the tempo for the soldiers behind him. They came, many and ragged, with ropes and hooks, and a single stubborn hope that had outlived fear. Above them the ramparts belched flame. The defenders poured oil and shouted old names and worse prayers. Arrows darkened the air like a living web. Chief had taught his men to meet such a rain with the old Spartan steadiness, kneel and breathe, and let the storm pass over the shield. But his shields were not round wood, but a hum and a curve of light that drank the heat and flung the sparks away. For each flaming brand, the invaders answered with a small, cold fire grenades that did not burn the flesh, but froze motion, sealing a bowstring, knuckling a hand with sudden numbness. It was a new kind of war, and yet the old world learned its shapes as quickly as it could. On the parapet, the clash became a poem of sounds: metal ringing, cloth ripping, the slap of boots on wet stone. A dart of elven steel sang past Chief's ear, and found the weather eye of his armor. The blow rattled through the plates, but did not break him. He glanced back once, and the young captain at his side met that look with an answering grimness. "We hold the stair," the man said, voice cut short by smoke. He had the look of those who had carved their courage from bedrock and would not unmake it now. Chief nodded. He did not speak his name. He did not need to. His motions spoke instead, an order, a promise, a plan. Beyond the first wall lay a narrow passage where the defenders had set a hedge of stakes and burning tar. The men stumbled into that trap and coughed like beasts. Chief moved through without a sound, his movements precise as harvesting. He knelt where a man might have died and set a small charge against the mortared seam. Those who stood about him did not see him plant the fuse. They felt the change in the air, the deep intake before the sea breaks. When the stone surrendered, it did so in a measured collapse that opened a throat of passage, not a yawning wound. Men spilled through screaming and cheering together, inch by inch, bearing the press of 100 lives. The inner bailey was a raven's nest of timbers and tents, and the stink of men crowded beneath the banners of their lord. From that knot of color came the black captain. He strode with a cloak of raven feathers and eyes like cooled iron. He had been carved somewhere between cruelty and sharp services, a man who learned war as others learned to speak. He raised his blade, and from a horn at his hip, a small wolf cried like a tired bell. Soldiers fell in line behind him, and for a moment the two lines regarded one another as old rivals do on a road where old debts are repaid. They met close and ugly. Chief did not shout. He set the cadence with a single decisive swing that sent a man staggering into the muck. The black captain moved with a showman's cruelty, seeking to make an example of the invader in bright strokes. The clash of their arms rang through the yard like thunder caught in a bowl. The chief's motions were economical, each strike saving breath, each parry a small calculus of consequences. When a man tried to strike from behind, the Spartan's arm turned like a hinge, and the strike found no purchase. The black captain hissed a curse, and then another, older sound slipped from his throat, an oath in a tongue that had not been spoken aloud in that keep since its first stones were put. Nearby, a woman from the northern guard, braids smoked with dust, fired bolts from a heavy crossbow. Her shot screamed and thudded into timber, and one of them toppled a standard, sending a flutter of silk into the mud. She looked to Chief as if asking permission to do more than defend. He angled his head, a small motion, and she moved like a hunter. Her next bolt flew true and smashed the wheel of a siege engine, halting its roll with a sound like a great beast dying. Men cheered, but the cheer was quickly swallowed by the horn in the black captain's throat. He had other engines yet, and he was not without reserve. Far above the outer curtain, a tower broke open, and a tide of riders poured through, beasts that smelled of smoke and wire, their bridles clinking with metal none of the defenders had seen. The sound of them was a different world, a mechanical shriek that set dogs a-wailing in every homestead. They drew close to the wall and began to set ladders, but the ladders were strange, skeins of iron that folded and unfolded themselves and bit into stone like teeth. Chief moved toward them, past a fallen standard and a father who had been too slow to reach his son. He picked up a pike and planted it at the foot of the nearest ladder. Where a soldier might have been repelled by the closeness of arms, Chief used leverage and throw, and the great iron teeth misjudged their purchase and slipped free, carrying a few foes into the mud. A clatter of drums signaled a shift in the enemy's pattern. The black captain vanished amidst the press, and with him went a small company of shadowy men bearing a lantern that burned with an unwholesome green. Where the lantern passed, men moved slower, like men in sleepwalking, their hunger sated for a moment by illusions. Chief ordered 2 men to shadow that passing quietly, as a hunter shadows a fox. The 2 slipped after the light and found themselves not in a corridor, but at a narrow gate beneath the hearth, a sally port perhaps meant for men to flee by. Its iron was old and pitted but fast, and the lock tasted faintly of arcane measures. Chief knelt, and, with the patience of a mason setting a keystone, he set a device there that hummed and shifted. Sparks ran along the seam like water. The lock gave with a sigh. Inside the sallyport, the air was different, cool and dry and smelling faintly of old leather. It opened onto a passageway that ran beneath the outer wall and emerged behind the command tent, where the black captain might kneel to supper and not expect such rude guests. Chief peered into that corridor. It was narrow and black, a throat cut through a belly of stone. He measured it with his mind as men measure distance with a finger. 24 paces, a right at the fag end, then up 3 steps into the hard light of a tent. It was a place for arrows and knives, for breath and a sudden clean law imposed by a few hands. "My command?" the young captain asked. His voice had lost its earlier bravado. The camp smelled of wet wool and stale ale and 1,000 tiny fears. "We can surge the gate. We can hammer it down while they are distracted." He did not finish, for he saw the cost of such thunder in the faces of his men, and it sat badly even in his dreams. Chief looked at him, then at the passage, then at the arching sky where the siege towers were being readied to turn their great mouths. A lantern winked in the black captain's tent. The directive that passed from Chief was a thing without lyric, a tilt of the hand, an index of numbers in his head, the crossing of a threshold in thought. He would not take the whole force through that tunnel. To drive through the gate would be to play at storming a mountain with only the weight of boulders and not the cunning of miners. He wanted instead a small strike, precise and swift, to take or slay the black captain while the mass of the enemy still thought themselves secure. 4, he said at last. His voice was a low instrument that did not pretend softness. He named the number like a law. 2 with hooks, 2 with blades. The captain swallowed and set his shoulder to the task of choosing. He named 2, one a veteran with a scar across his face, the other a boy whose hands trembled but whose eyes held an ember no fear could put out. Chief took no names. He counted instead the small measures of time they had. He measured wind and centuries and the way the shadow from the central lamp lay across the tent flap. They moved like ghosts. The passage smelled of damp and old, the steps of their feet like muffled drums. Above them, the war was a distant ocean. Below the arch of stone, a mote of gold blinked where the black captain had set his lamp. Chief could see it through a sliver in the canvas. He thought of the men at the outer walls. He thought of a city that had lent itself to fire and would not be burned without an answer. He thought for a single measured breath of the machine that had brought him here and the long road of iron and sky that lay behind him. Then he set his hand on the latch of the sallyport. The door opened into a ring of light. A tent canted like a watchman's jaw. The black captain lifted his head, and for the breadth of a heartbeat, his face was the face of a man who believed himself secure. Chief stepped out, 4 figures behind him, and the future tightened like a bowstring. They would not have many moments, and in those moments the fate of a siege can be turned or broken. He moved forward, blades ready, the air full of the promise of blunt ends and bright decisions. The hammer of the assault waited beyond that tent, and it watched, patient as a tide. Chief crossed the threshold,